You are listening to Proof Text, a Glossa House podcast exploring Scripture and all things related to it. New episodes are released daily. For more information, check out glossahouse.com and subscribe to our channels on Spotify and YouTube. Welcome and enjoy.
Hello and welcome to Proof Text and Glossa House TV. I am Michael Halcomb, and today I have the great privilege of talking with Dr. Craig Ott. So did I say your last name right?
Yeah, that's fine.
Awesome. So it's nice to meet you. Can I call you Craig for the interview?
That's fine. Okay? Sure.
All right. Dr. Ott, Craig is a professor. He's a author as well. We'll talk about some of his books here in just a bit, but he's a professor of mission and intercultural studies at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School, otherwise known as TEDS, in Deerfield, Illinois, and directs the PhD program in intercultural studies. And as I said, he's written numerous books, and we're going to be discussing some of those today. If you go to Amazon.com, I'll just show those of you who are watching, I'm going to share the screen here with you for a minute. You'll see some of the books here that he's authored or co-authored or contributed to: The Church on Mission, Globalizing Theology, Encountering Theology of Mission, Global Church Planning, The Mission of the Church, Teaching and Learning Across Cultures, Missionary Methods Against the Tide, and several of these books in other languages. So, Dr. Ott, it's great to have you on the program today, and I'm excited to chat. So tell us a little bit about yourself, if I've missed anything that you'd like to throw out there.
Sure. Well, just one minor correction there. I'm no longer directing the PhD program. I've handed that off to somebody else, and I'm able to do other things now.
All right.
Although I'm still working with a lot of doctoral students, mentoring them. But just sort of the real short version. I did not grow up in a Christian home. Became a Christian during my time at a state university, and that was the Jesus Movement days. Okay. And but felt God's calling into my life to enter some form of Christian ministry. So I went to seminary, ended up meeting my wife there. We served for over 20 years in Germany. Most of that time was in church planting. And then I got my doctorate and began to transition into more and more missionary training and teaching at the formal level. And then came to Trinity for a position here. And so what was somewhat unique about my position was that I was allowed to commit about 25% of my time, not just to, classroom teaching here, but to doing a lot of international work and consulting with emerging movements, very exciting, doing missionary training and formal teaching all over the world. So my position has been such that I've kind of integrated a lot of what's happening sort of on the ground in various parts of the world with what's going on with our research and classroom teaching and so on.
So where did you grow up? You mentioned you didn't, grow up going to church, or didn't grow up a believer. Where was that?
Yeah, I like to joke with people that I grew up at LAX. I grew up in Los Angeles, and it was 500 feet from the North Runway. The house I grew up in was eventually bought by the city and its parking lot now, I think. But I grew up in LA, Southern California, and that was, where a lot of exciting things were happening, like I say, with the Jesus Movement and sort of a youth revival of sorts. And so that's where my roots are.
And where did you end up at seminary?
Yeah, well, I came here to the cold country of Chicagoland and went to Trinity.
Okay.
That of course was a culture shock in and of itself, going from sort of Southern California lifestyle to the Midwest. But at that time, I felt that was the best place for me, and they had a very strong emphasis in those days on apologetics, and I was interested in that. I had a minor in philosophy in college and so on. So so I went to Trinity for my seminary education, and then after going, we did some church planting in the Chicago area, then went to Germany and did my doctorate sort of here and there while I was doing mission work in Germany, and also did that at Trinity.
So you just mentioned moving from LA and into the Midwest. Chicago was kind of culture shock. Then you moved to Germany, which I imagine is kind of another culture shock. Moving overseas like that. Um, is is are those moves like did those moves like ignite the interest in on the one hand, like missions, and I'd like to talk about what is missions, but did they ignite the interest in missions, the passion for missions, and then also like being in those different cultures? I mean, one of the books I really want to talk about with you today that you've written is teaching and learning across cultures. So is did those moves sort of ignite that, or is there more to that? Say a little bit about
Well,
that.
it probably, my sense of God's leading into cross cultural mission really came while I was still sort of my last year of college.
Hmm.
And I went to Long Beach State. And, again, it was very much of a sort of revival atmosphere. And I found myself leading, Bible study in the dormitory and then that sort of thing. And just from some reading, some books, and just different exposure, read J. Hudson Taylor's biography and so on. And that just really opened up a whole new world,
Hmm.
not growing up in a Christian home or going to church or anything. This whole idea of global missions, world missions was something really new. And so that had already piqued my interest. Then when I did come to seminary, I was meeting international students, learning
Hmm.
about other parts of the world. And it was just like, wow, I think this is where God wants me to serve, this is where there are greater needs and so on. Um, and more specifically, there was a leader from the German church that had come to campus and was speaking, and he really encouraged us, come work together with us, work under our sort of home missions program, uh, and that was the way we wanted to work alongside of with local believers, national leadership, and so on. And so that's how we ended up in Germany.
Hmm. So you've been also working, as you mentioned, we're leading a PhD program. Now you're still working with students, even though you're not leading that. And the title of this book, I've mentioned it several times already: Teaching and Learning Across Cultures. Give us some insight into what was like the genesis of this book. And if you're watching, you should see it on the screen right now. Um, a guide to theory and practice. What was the genesis of this book? Where did this come from?
So if we go back to my first church plant in Germany, there was a big frustration because in our situation there, everybody was pretty much a new believer. And so the whole idea of how am I going to help develop leaders at the local level, without sending them away to seminary or something like that.
Right.
And that's what prompted me really to do doctoral work. I wasn't planning on going to academics at all. It was really more the practical question: how do we develop leaders in the context of the local church? So my concern for training, education, and so on developed there. Well, then as I began teaching later on, as I was teaching and training missionaries, I started teaching this course on teaching across cultures because I'd already gotten involved a lot with pedagogy and adult
Yeah.
learning and so on. And so really after teaching that course for 25 years and developing it, and what I really liked about it was I was always having students write case studies. So most of my
Mm.
students were people who had cross-cultural experience. They had been a missionary or pastor, a teacher internationally, and they had all these wonderful examples that I didn't have. And
Mm.
so I'd been collecting these over the years. And I said, I've developed these lectures, I've developed the material, I've got all kinds of good practical examples from my own experience and from students. I need to really put this into book form. Most of the books that had been written on this topic, they were either sort of small, popular, which is nice, for the reader, kind of quick get into the information, or they were highly, highly technical or specialized. And so the need for a book that went into more depth, that has sort of maybe a textbook feel to it, and yet does a good job of integrating good theory with practice. That's the subtitle. Um,
Yeah.
that's what I really wanted to put together, and that's what came together in this book.
Great. So, looking at the table of contents here, um, you mentioned these. these 5 dimensions: the cognitive dimension, the worldview dimension, social dimension, media dimension, and environmental dimension. I think it'd be good to talk about each of those, but I'm interested too in chapter 3, learning styles and teaching styles. I remember, so I'm a language teacher, and uh, I've presented at SBL conferences and these sorts of conferences on like language pedagogy, and there's actually quite a bit of debate. I was surprised to learn about whether there's a such thing as learning styles, right? And that's kind of interesting. So it is fascinating for me to see in the book that you mention learning styles, but then you actually move away from that to dimensions. So yeah, say a little bit about that.
Yeah. Well, it's not the main topic of the book, but it's probably the most controversial, if you will, because like you say, there are some people who are kind of these advocates of learning styles, and you have to know your child's learning style or they will
Right.
fail. And, the very dramatized sort of approach to this. And almost everybody says, yeah, I think I got a learning style. I'm more visual, or I'm more this or
Right.
that.
Right.
And so it tends to be sort of a self-reinforcing concept.
Hmm.
The reality is the research does not support most of that
Right.
concept. Okay. And it can actually be harmful in the sense that it often is given the impression, if you're this kind of learner,
Right.
you cannot be that kind of learner.
Exactly. Yes.
And that I don't think is a healthy thing.
Yeah.
Now, some people may feel more naturally comfortable with one thing or the other, but I think that's a mistake to sort of pigeonhole people in that way. And I think it's actually limiting of people's potential. So some of that popular rhetoric around learning styles,
Yeah.
I pretty much reject. At the same time, there are individual differences. Anybody who has more than one child knows, that kid's just kind of naturally musical, or that kid's naturally mechanical, or, we all have our individual differences. Now, when you come to culture, it's a little bit of a different situation, because we're not talking as much about individuals. We're talking about collective groups in a society. And so if we've all gone to schools that teach in a certain way, that creates an expectation. A good teacher does this. A good teacher doesn't do that. So that has kind of shaped our expectations. And it's also kind of shaped our preferences, what we become comfortable with. It's also shaped how we socially relate to teachers and our fellow students and so on and so forth. And so, in one sense, there are these culturally shaped, I prefer the word preferences or expectations, get away from the style language. That's a little bit too pigeonholing. Um, and then we can talk about some of these differences and how we should deal with them. How much should we sort of adapt our teaching to that expectation? Or at what point do we say, no, it's actually good to expand, challenge people a little, and help them learn in different ways that is maybe not their preferred way of learning.
Mm.
So I've taken a little more nuanced view of that, and more of a developmental, let's expand the way we learn. Let's expand our abilities instead of just saying, I'm this or I'm that.
That's great. I love that. As someone who teaches biblical languages, I use a communicative approach, right, where I teach in Greek. So I'm trying to teach biblical Greek by speaking biblical Greek, and that's a foreign concept in a lot of biblical language classrooms. But you will get the same exact thing: the student who says, "I'm more of a book learner," versus the student who says, "Well, I'm more of like an oral learner," right? And it's like, well, no, it doesn't have to be one or the other. I don't think you are one or the other. I love the language of like the developmental. If you have I guess a lean or a preference saying toward like one of these kinds of things, well, let's develop the other area then, right? And get strength in that area. So I like that a lot.
Well, and just another thing here too, um, even if you were to sort of accept this theory of the different learning styles in a sort of rigid way, um, good teachers always use a variety.
Right.
And
So true.
so in that sense, you're going to reach more people, and you're going to expose people to other ways of learning. So whether you're using more of an oral approach or more of a literature-based reading approach, or even role playing and some of these more activating kinds of approaches, it makes it more interesting usually for the students.
Right.
Although you may have to let them know what the pedagogical value of this is, and that's where some of the challenge comes in. Again, especially culturally, where you may have some students who come from a culture that says, "No, it's a teacher's job to tell me what the answers are."
Hmm.
In a lot of our
Makes me
Western education, it's kind of like, no, the teacher should kind of guide you.
right.
The Socratic method, if I just ask the right questions, they'll kind of discover it on their own. Well, those are two extremely different approaches to what it means to learn.
Right.
And if I just start, even if I have students and all I want to do is sort of discuss with them and try and prompt them to discover for themselves, they're going to say, "You're not a very good teacher because you know the answers. Why don't you just tell us?
Right.
You're not being fair to us." So you have these different expectations you have to navigate. So here again, sometimes the best strategy is to use a variety of teaching
Hmm.
methods and not just sort of gravitate whatever the way I was taught or whatever I just happen to
Right.
like for myself.
It makes me think too, like just thinking like outside of the realm of education for a minute about that the book, The Five Love Languages, right? Is it really like that? You only have, like this one, or do we all in some fashion like need all five of the buckets filled, or however he talks about, or like I don't know, the Enneagram, right? You have these eight personality or nine personality. Is really all of humanity boiled down to eight or nine, personality thing? Like, we seem to have a sort of obsession with trying to like boil everything down to the lowest common denominator that we can possibly get to. But I don't know. I'm going on a tangent here, but
Well, it's actually not that much of a tangent
yeah.
as you might think. I have another article that was published in Missiology about this whole tension between having sort of different categories about cultural difference and at the same time realizing these are more fluid. They're not these,
Mm,
again, they're not boxes. They're much more fluid and people change over time and so on and so forth. And I used sort of the subtitle was between Obelix and Colbert.
mm,
There's a French sort of comic asterisks on Obelix, and it's from the Romans when the Romans were occupying France, and they're from Gaul, and so Obelix is always saying the Romans are crazy, the Romans are crazy. So he's sort of saying all Romans are like this, crazy.
right, right.
Well, then you've got a famous saying that Stephen Colbert had: "Don't bother me with the facts. I'm sticking with the truth." And where you've got a theory and you don't care what the research, what the data says, you just got a theory and you're going to live with that theory. And so the truth is usually, going to be more like somewhere in the middle there.
Right.
And so on the one hand, I do think it's helpful to have categories to talk about
Hmm.
differences as
Right.
long as we don't make them into these sort of rigid pigeonholes that people get put into. We don't start stereotyping, all Romans are
Mm,
crazy, all Americans are superficial, and, these sort of
right.
stereotypes that are really harmful. But there's always going to be a variety. There's going to be some Americans who are superficial, some who are deep, and be
Right.
careful with that. But we can talk about general tendencies of differences between cultures. And that can be helpful. If
Yeah.
I go to another country, I go to Japan, it may be helpful to know certain things about that culture, the way people deal with conflict, or that
Yeah.
I would find confusing. Or I might even accuse people of being dishonest, but they're not being dishonest. They're just using the tools that they've learned in their culture. So knowing something, having certain handles to talk about cultural difference is helpful as long as they don't turn into stereotypes and sort of make us prejudiced in that way.
Yeah. So I I do stand up comedy, right? And of course, one of the things that you have to play on are some of these like uh cultural stereotypes, geographical stereotypes, like, right, that's what makes a joke go. Um
Mm.
and if you play too hard, or you sometimes don't go far enough, the joke is not going to go. And so that's, so to some degree, right, there's like truth about these generalities, seeming generalities, culture generalities, that geographically exist, or uh, you know culturally exist, or linguistically exist, or economically exist, and so on and so forth. So sometimes like those categories and stereotypes exist, but um they aren't, as you're mentioning, there's always variety, right? There's always outliers, there's always differences. And I actually tend to think that we've gotten so uptight, too uptight about the the generalities and those sorts of things. But I think we need to get back to laughing about those sorts of things. But
Yeah,
yeah,
and sometimes by laughing about it, it exposes a caricature. Like, oh,
right,
okay, that is a caricature,
right.
and let's name it that way and laugh about it instead of sort of subtly thinking, gee, I think they're all like this, really, you know.
I love that. That's a great way to put it. So in the book, I mentioned this a moment ago about the several dimensions. And could we just like walk through what you mean by these various dimensions? You talk about first the cognitive dimension, and then you mentioned concrete, abstract thinking, holistic and analytic, and these sorts of things. So, what is the cognitive dimension? Give us sort of the heartbeat of that.
Yeah, sort of the simple way to put that is just sort of the way we process information, the way we perceive information, and then kind of the way we organize it. And in our Western tradition, we tend, again, a little bit of a stereotype, but we tend to be pretty analytical. So we like to have these categories, and we like to break things down into there's parts a lot. So that's very analytical. Whereas in a lot of other cultures, or not just cultures, but people will perceive something more as a whole and less as a bunch of little parts.
Hmm.
Um, and there's advantages to each. By being a little more analytical, we can break things down and determine what's causing what. That's the scientific method. But it has a temptation to be reductionistic and say, well, this one thing is the key to everything.
Hmm.
Whereas more people who think more holistically realize life is more complicated than that, and a lot of different things affect a lot of other things. And so they're just different ways of kind of perceiving the information. Actually, even there's all kinds of interesting psychological tests that have been done. Um, for example, people who tend to be more holistic will pick up body language subconsciously more than people who are more analytic. So the analytic person says, I'm focusing in just on what you're talking about, what you're saying. And so I'm kind of not paying attention to your body language as much. Where the person who's more holistic, they're not only hearing what you're saying, but they're checking out, your body language, like, oh, I think
Hmm.
he's uptight, or, something like that. So there's advantages and disadvantages to
Right.
each of these sort of what I call sort of orientations. Um, and sometimes the way we tend to teach, if it's overly analytical, then people who are more holistic are saying, how does that fit into the bigger picture? And so this is why a lot of the more narrative approaches that are being used now, even teach theology, biblical theology, sort of grand narrative of
Yeah.
Scripture. This is a lot more compelling. Now, I think everybody should learn this approach to the biblical story. But some learners, that's going to resonate and help them orient themselves much
Hmm.
better. I mean, just think of your typical seminary curriculum. Sometimes they're built like take the Old Testament classes first, then the New, but not always. So you may
Right.
take that New Testament class and you go back and take a class on Genesis or whatever. And we do this then with our Sunday school children. And then we wonder why the children don't know if did Jesus live before or after Moses?
Hmm.
So they might know the Jesus stories, but they don't have the big picture. So
Right.
anyway, these are just, simple examples of how sometimes by being over analytic, we can miss the big picture.
Hmm. So the it made me think, or at least brought back to mind for me the idea of nature and nurture. And my question was, is a person more um analytic or holistic by nature or by nurture? Is that just a false dichotomy, or like, yeah, I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
Like so many things, there's probably a bit of a mix there. A lot of these studies about cognitive style, and some of them are pretty technical, using different kinds of tests. I mentioned some of those in the book. For a while they were finding some gender differences there, but um, it's not entirely clear. Like so many things, again, if we go back to a child who's musical, you can still probably teach most children some basics about music, but it's not going to be their natural.
Yeah.
Um, and so I think there's a little bit of both going on there. If you've grown up in an environment where people are, well, let's just say, I'll take an extreme case. You've grown up in a rural village where there are no straight roads. You don't have a straight horizon, when you look
Mm.
down the road. And even the houses are not built with perfectly straight lines that are perfectly square and all this. Well, just there, even your perceptive ability. So then we come and we have these geometric figures in school books. Well, that child who's never even seen straight lines, all the roads go like this, the rivers go like this, the trees grow like that. Even something like that is going to be a bit more of a learning curve. Now, that's environment, right? It doesn't mean that that child or that person is somehow cognitively deficient. They're not mentally impaired. It just means that they have not been exposed to geometric figures. That's
Mm.
some of these were problems with the older, not so much today, but older IQ tests and stuff that, they'd be giving children a test with a geometric figure if they've never seen a geometric figure before, sort of thing. But it is a mix. I think it's a bit of a mix, but I do think that probably environment has a lot more to do with it. If you've gone to schools most of your life from grade school on, and you had fill in the blank sorts of tests and quizzes, that's a very analytical way. A
Right.
little story that one of my students had, he was in, I think it was Papua New Guinea, and they were teaching language skills and literacy, and finding out that if they had these typical sort of fill in the blank, what's the right verb form? Probably do this with Greek, maybe, I don't know. But you have these fill in the blanks. Yesterday I blanked to the grocery store. So go, went, future tense, so that the students had a terrible time trying to fill in a blank. Whereas if you ask them, tell me about what you did yesterday, did you go shopping? Give me a full sentence. Oh, yesterday I went shopping. They could get it because there was a flow to it and there was a context to it. Where in the fill in the blank is like, this is first of all, it's just a sort of a writing thing on a piece of paper. I'm not speaking. Second of all, I've got to somehow dissect the grammar of this sentence, which I would never naturally do. When we're naturally speaking, we go, wait a minute, what's the past tense of go? We don't do that. So
Right.
anyway, it's just a simple example of somebody who's not been taught from childhood these kinds of things, fill in the blanks or these kinds of ways of learning. And then we go international, and then we start employing these methods with people who are just not familiar with them, and then wonder why they don't seem to be learning well. And then we jump to conclusions of, well, they're just not smart, or,
Right.
something like
Right.
that.
This seems to have major ramifications for testing. Um, you know, uh, it would seem to me that I mean, we could talk about the other 5 dimensions too, or the other 4 dimensions, but like, if all of these dimensions are involved, like, and you grow up in a culture where one maybe is favored, or something like that, like, it just seems like something like it would really call testing into question. This is, as an educator myself, this has been something I've studied for years and years and years. Testing just frustrates me to no end. And some of this is like the reasons why. There are a multitude of reasons, but the example of, if you never grew up with straight lines, like, that's an amazing example, I think. And then somebody puts geometric figures in front of you that are all, clean cut straight lines. It just seems there's a major disadvantage already. Yeah, I don't know. What are your thoughts on just
Well, I know
testing in
that,
general?
for example, I believe Jay Moon, one of the professor at Asbury, has actually given students, I believe, if I'm correct here, is given them kind of an option if they want to do more of an oral form of an exam or more of a written form of an exam. I don't know if that's the best way to always go, but you might have, some people in an oral situation are just going to freeze because of the
Yeah.
social, pressure sort of thing. So there's other elements going on there. What I have done is I've tried to give a little bit more variety in the kinds of assignments I have. So just a simple example, I teach contextualization. So we use different case studies. Now, most of those nice thing about a case study is practical. It's a real situation. So we're not just talking theory. So you can see how theory might play out in a specific particular case. In the last couple of years, I've started using a video case study. It's sort of an evangelistic, or that one, well, there's a couple. There's an evangelistic presentation that's sort of a video version using a narrative. And then there's another one sort of explaining about different kinds of movements and so on. So, but by having a video that has either story that goes with it or, diagrams and so on, and then they can evaluate that versus just using a written text. So sometimes you can just mix things up a little bit. And, in that particular course, I give students an option which case studies they want to analyze. So, I think we can sometimes do these things, but at the same time, as I was saying earlier, we can help stretch people to expand their learning strategies.
Right.
And we have to do that thoughtfully. Sometimes a teacher will come in and just try and get students to do something they've never done before, and then they're just kind of confused. Like, why are we doing this? Why are we wasting our time? And so sometimes just by sort of explaining your pedagogical reason for doing it this way, like, this may seem strange to you right now, but bear with me. I think here's the purpose of why I think it's going to help you. And then, okay, we'll go with you then, because at least I have an idea of what you're trying to accomplish. But see, again, when we go into another cultural setting, often we're just not even aware of that gap. So this is part of the purpose of the book, is just say, hey, there's some of these gaps out there. And if you're going to come in and try and use this approach, your students just may not understand what you're doing. So you may need to pick them up where they're at, use some of the methods that are familiar, and then gradually introduce some different kinds of learning strategies.
So another one of the dimensions is worldview. I've seen a book. I haven't gotten to read it, but it just recently came out that is interestingly challenging the idea of worldview. So I'm curious to see what that's all about. And I haven't been much involved in those kinds of discussions as of late. But what is worldview, and what is the worldview dimension?
Yeah, you're right. Part of the problem here is that the concept of worldview has been overworked. Some people are trying to make worldview do too much, as if you could explain all of life if you can just somehow describe a person's worldview. And most experts nowadays, particularly in the world of anthropology, say that's way too simplistic because our environment affects our worldview. Technology starts changing our worldview. So to sort of say worldview is the driver of everything in life, I think this is where a lot of the critics come in, and then it's not very well defined. If we and I know people who have rejected the concept of worldview, but then if you break it down a little and say, do you believe people have different understandings of causality, why things happen? Well, they say, oh, yes, of course. Some people believe everything happens because of a spiritual reason. There was a curse, there was a demon, something like that. Well, that's a part of this bigger worldview concept. Or we can say something like, what does it mean to learn? Well, again, in our Western world, we tend to have a more constructivist view that says you learn by discovering. And you internalize that learning if you've discovered it more for yourself than somebody just telling you it. But see, if you come from a world that says learning is what has been passed on by tradition through the ages, which has stood the test of time, we live in difficult circumstances. And guess what? Even though we've had drought and famine and war, we're still alive. And that's because we have the wisdom of the ages, and we're still planting our crops the way we did it in the old days. And so tradition and passing on wisdom, there's a more emphasis on wisdom, means that
Yeah.
the young whippersnapper has no right to say, I discovered the truth for myself. That would be arrogant. So now if I come in and say, no, I want you to discover for yourself, the meaning of this biblical text, they'll say, no, you're the wise person. You've learned. You tell us. So
Mm,
now that's a worldview kind of issue because it's basically saying, how do we know that knowledge is knowledge?
right.
It's a philosophical way of framing it,
Right.
epistemology, right? So yes, the concept of worldview has been overworked. It's been not well defined, and we need to be cautious about that. But if all we're saying is that people have different bases for saying something's true, or people have different ways of explaining why things happen, then I think we're still on safe ground, and that's the approach I take with the book.
That's great. I think that if I remember correctly, the book that I was, uh, thinking of that actually was subtitle was something along those lines. You know, I can't remember the exact title, but the challenge of worldview, or questioning worldview as opposed to like the Christian life as a pursuit of wisdom. So it's interesting, to hear you say that. And then you mentioned the social dimension. So say a little bit about that.
Well, let's just take something as simple as respect for elders, um, and who's a conversation partner. And if you have a society where these kinds of social norms are in place, that you always respect the older person, and you put that into the classroom, and then you've got a teacher who has higher status. That teacher is supposedly, they've learned from other teachers and they have a degree or something like that. Then it's not the place for the student to even ask a question in class,
Hmm.
because asking a question could be perceived in all kinds of bad ways. For example,
Oh, wow.
the student asks a question. Is that student insinuating the teacher didn't explain it clearly?
Hmm.
Or asking a question, is that challenging the teacher? So
Hmm.
even something as simple as a student asking the teacher a question might be considered inappropriate for all
Like
kinds of reasons.
an honor challenge or shaming or something like that, right?
Right.
Oh.
And then if you have a more collectivistic sort of society, well, no kid wants to be the kid that always asks questions like, oh, you think you're smarter than everybody else. So even the kid who's maybe really, really is smart and has great questions doesn't want to speak up because he doesn't want all the other kids to look at him and go, hey, you're making us look bad, or, you're the
Hmm.
special person, like that. I mean, that can even happen in American schools. So, so the social collective nature of how students relate to one another can affect something like classroom discussions and so on. And so I found teaching internationally, it can be pretty difficult if you've got a larger room full of people to get a discussion going.
Hmm.
People don't want to be challenging a different opinion to the teacher, that definitely not. And even expressing their opinions with others where a conversation goes back and forth, that can be perceived as adversarial. So what I found is you break people into smaller groups. You get them in as little groups of 3 or 4 people, then they're much more willing to talk, and they're much more
Hmm.
willing to. And again, even in the U.S., that is a strategy to get people talking more. But be that as it may, that's all of this has to do with this sort of social dimension, how that's shaping
Yeah.
teacher expectations, student expectations,
Hmm.
and if I'm not alert to that, I can just think, well, what's with these students? Why don't they talk?
Hmm.
But
Right.
in their social norms, it's not appropriate for them to talk.
That's that's great. I mean, for a teacher going into to a foreign context, and yeah, you may be trying to pull dialogue out of students or whatever, and yeah, there may be that uh that honor factor or shame factor in play. That's a really good reminder. um
And and we see that with international students here in the
yeah,
U.S. Now, there's always,
right.
American students are going to be shy also. There's
Yeah.
always going to be students that are just more shy. But we do see that sometimes especially pronounced with international students who, again, they come from a culture where you just don't really talk much, especially you wouldn't ask a question of a teacher or contradict them or anything like that. And this is where, again, by breaking them into smaller groups, getting them to talk, and then what you kind of have is a spokesman for the group. So it's not
Right.
an individual saying, this is my
Right.
opinion. It sort of speaks for their little group. Well, what did your group find out? And then it's not just one person sort of saying their opinion so much. So they're just little strategies like that. They're not complicated. We can use them in an American classroom or an international classroom, and they tend to work almost everywhere pretty good.
Right. Something that's really interesting. So one of my courses that I teach a few sections of is Comp One. So I'm in a school where I have foreign students in every class, and we meet twice a week this semester. And on Tuesdays, so we have an hour and 20 minutes. But I teach them joke writing. So that seems like a interesting. So Tuesdays are joke writing, Thursdays are essay writing. And I'm arguing in the class. Essentially, these are really a lot of the same thing, right? You got to speak from a point of view. You have to pick a topic and go with it, so on. So you got to have a voice, but there's a lot of resistance early on to the idea of joke writing, whether from like students from the U.S. or more particularly the foreign students. A couple weeks ago, I had one of the foreign students, a student from Ukraine, say, "I hate jokes." I don't think she hated jokes, but then she said, I think American humor is just so stupid, right?"
Well, see, here again, that's something that's very, very cultural. And most of
Right,
us, say
right,
English speakers, if you ever watch British humor,
right.
say, wow,
Yeah,
that's different. I mean, some
yes,
people will find it funny, some will just find it weird. So culture, what is humorous is a very cultural thing. So if
yes,
you're asking your students to write a joke, and then so much humor is very nuanced,
right,
dealing with specific issues from the general culture or
yes,
minority groups or whatever, you know. So that also makes it a little tricky. But you bring up a really interesting point now about composition, because in some cultures, this relates a little to the social part, that it's considered a little bit too brusque, a little too in your face if I begin an essay with like a thesis statement.
mm,
In some cultures. Now, we usually like to see something like that in American
yeah,
writing.
right, right,
Tell us in your introductory paragraph, what is this about? Is there a thesis, a theory you're going to develop, and kind of tell us how you're going to do it, and then you do it, and then you say it again, right? So that's kind of a general structure that we'd like to see. And you can follow it easily for us.
right.
Now, in some cultures, that would be way too arrogant to put out in
Huh,
the very first paragraph, this is what my theory is. So what you do is you don't do that. You might raise a question and then you gently approach it. And here's some
right.
information that's kind of interesting. And then, okay, let's go back over here. Here's some interesting information. And you kind of gradually go
Mm,
around and you circle around. And then you say, so this seems to be proposing this. It's very, very tentative. I'm not,
mm,
boom, saying this is my theory.
right,
And so what very often happens is the American teacher, anything being a theology class or American literature, or whatever, they're reading that paper, and what they will say is, why are you beating around the bush? Tell me what you want to tell me what you're
right.
trying to say here. Why do I have to wait to the end? And why are you going around and around and around? But that is the way some people have been taught
Mm,
to present an essay. So here again, culture has shaped them. It's partly
right,
social, that a young person shouldn't be arrogant, and it's partly just the way their logic works. It's more holistic. You attack something from this way, then you attack it from that way, and you look at the whole picture instead of saying point one is this, point two is that, point three is that. So
fascinating.
again, these are cultural norms. Now, I have to sometimes say to my students, look, you've chosen to study in the United States.
Right,
You've studied to study at a high level, at a graduate level, or even a doctoral level. And internationally, even at a high level, there are expectations of writing style. So again, you have to sort of
right.
enculture them into academic writing style. But that's a big learning curve for a lot of students.
Yeah, definitely. And what I've witnessed, right? So this Ukrainian student, for example. So each student had to just do 1 minute of stand up, right? And they had 5 to 7 jokes, original jokes they had to write. And I pulled out of 60 students, I pulled the best 11 jokes out of several hundred. And I sent them to one of my buddies, and we talk comedy a lot. His favorite joke out of all the jokes was the one this Ukrainian student wrote. And so I went up to her and I was like, hey, I shared this with my friend, and he thought it was the best joke. And she was like, really? And so that boosted her confidence. But I've also noticed that teaching them to write humor, at least from kind of an American perspective, is actually helping them get jokes from their classmates and the humor from their friends. And it has been some like enculturation happening there that I think has been really beneficial, actually, in terms of like social interactions with their peers.
Yeah,
Yeah.
humor really does tell us a lot about ourselves, because when we laugh at ourselves, we're usually laughing about something that has some reality to it,
Right. Right.
and so a lot of humor exaggerates that reality, right,
Yes. Yes.
to make it funny.
Yes. So you have two other dimensions that you talk about here. You have the media dimension and then the environmental dimension. So say a little bit about those, and we'll wrap up here. But yeah.
Yeah, the media is in some ways pretty straightforward. And by that I'm using it in a very broad sense. So for a lot of teachers, it's lecture or reading. So it's very, very verbal.
Mm,
But we can use role playing, for example. That's not unusual in counseling, but it can be. I use role play sometimes teaching church planting. Um, so using something like role play. Another thing, and this is really um, using parables. Jesus taught a lot with parables. So
oh,
it's a verbal form,
right.
but his parables always had a twist to them, right? So it's the Samaritan that's a good guy. Now that gets your attention. So learning to actually even write parables. So you've got biblical parables, but then
Mm,
I've actually written some of my own parables, and you got to get a twist in them because it gets people's attention. It makes them rethink. So in other words, the parable of the Good Samaritan makes you rethink, what does it really mean to love your neighbor? And other parables of Jesus like that too. They've always got a little twist in them. But so parables, proverbs. In America, in Western culture, proverbs are kind of cute little, sayings. We don't take them very seriously. Many cultures take proverbs very seriously because that's wisdom that's been passed down. And in fact, sometimes they will quote a proverb in an academic essay. No, come on, you give us some good sources here, not some little
right.
proverb. But no, many times they say, look, I've taken the voice of wisdom. I'm making the voice of wisdom my voice. And so even use of proverbs. And again, Jay Moon has a book on intercultural discipleship, and he has lots and lots of examples of these kinds of things, teaching with proverbs. He studied proverbs in West Africa, ethnic group in
Mm,
West Africa, and how they use proverbs and how he began to use proverbs to teach. And it was very, very impactful. So again, the media is just saying, let's expand it out. Some media, like even visual media, like a video, can be confusing. There's funny stories about the Jesus film that miscommunicated. For example, you're familiar with the Jesus film. They're
yeah. Right.
translated into hundreds of
Yep.
languages, and Jesus is carrying this little satchel bag with him around, and then in one particular culture, they said, now we know how Jesus can perform his miracles because our shaman also carry a little bag like that with them,
Oh,
and
wow.
they have their magic stuff in that little bag. And so something as minor you would
Wow.
think as harmless as that became a miscommunication point. So there's a lot of assumption in video. Now nowadays people have seen a lot of Hollywood movies, and so they're familiar with some of these kinds of things. But again, sometimes we'll have to be made alert to those things. So that's kind of the media dimension.
Mm,
And then
interesting.
the environmental is what we have the least control over. So you're teaching in an tropical environment that is sweltering hot, humid, and so you discover why they have a siesta in the afternoon
Right.
because it gets so hot that you can't concentrate anymore. Even the local people who are used to that climate, it's hard for them to concentrate. So you have different life rhythms. Now, if you come in as an outsider in that, you're not going to change that. There's other environmental factors. If there are sensitivities to religious freedom,
Mm,
that you may not be able to be as free about the way you talk about certain things. So there's a whole variety of factors in the environment. The school that you teach at will have traditions. One of the things that often bothers American professors is plagiarism. We have standards for plagiarism, and it's more and more difficult with AI and the internet and everything. Plagiarism is always a challenge everywhere. But in other cultures, sometimes they have a more tolerant view of plagiarism. And so sometimes an American will come in there and say, hey, this is just way out of line. But the school says, we're not going to punish the student for that. So you've got the institutional environment that's going on there. And you have to somehow say, I'm either going to work with this institution or I can't. So those are all the factors that we enter into as a teacher. We have little control over, even in our home school. If I teach at a seminary here, there's expectations I'm going to have to conform to. So yeah.
Wow. Well, it's interesting for those of you watching or listening. Yeah, head over you can go to Baker Academic. You can pick up the book Teaching and Learning Across Cultures: A Guide to Theory and Practice by Dr. Craig Ott. And I showed you earlier, you can just go to Amazon.com and type in Craig Ott, and a whole bunch of books will pop up about missiology and missions and teaching and learning and these sorts of things. So, man, it's been a pleasure to talk with you, Craig, and to learn from you. And thanks for sharing your years of wisdom and experience. And it's been a great conversation. Yeah, I appreciate you. So
Yeah.
for those of you watching or listening, after you go pick up a copy of this book or the other books by Dr. Ott, head over to glossahouse.com and check out the great resources we have there as well. Always releasing new books. And yeah, if you're watching or listening, check out Proof Text Podcast and the video forum, Glossa House TV. Lots of great stuff on our YouTube channel. So yeah, we're gonna wrap it up there. Again, Dr. Ott, thanks so much for
Thanks
your
for
time.
having me.
Yeah, and thank you all for watching and listening. We're gonna stop there and say we hope that helps.
Interested in growing your ancient language skills but not sure where to start? Glossa House can help. From illustrated readers and short stories to lexicons and grammars, Glossa House offers a variety of resources for beginning, intermediate, and experienced ancient language learners. Head to glossahouse.com today. Glossa House, language resources for the global community.